Welcome back. Continuing our markets discussion. If we look at the last time that the president followed through on some of the tariff threats, even though he ended up kicking the can down the road on some of those, beginning of March, it was ugly. It was an ugly reaction by the markets. Next week, we have the major prospective plantings report from USDA, and we have the April 2nd tariff day. Sean, do you think next week we could actually have an even bigger impact on the markets when it comes to tariffs compared to last time?
I think the impact will be bigger. It could be bullish. It could be bearish. It really depends on duration. And is this it? Trump has continued to make headlines that maybe they're flexible. He could retaliate even further if there's retaliatory tariffs from the other side. It's really, really important to get a concept of how long and is this all we have to deal with? And I think a lot of what's going to happen on April 2nd is the market gauging those two key factors and determining what those exports or lack thereof are going to be going forward.
Yeah, as the market tries to gauge that, so are farmers trying to figure out, what do I do at this point? I mean, I'd had a farmer text me this morning, Mike, and he said, listen, I need higher prices, plain and simple. But what can farmers do in preparation for next week?
Well, I think at this standpoint, you have to be prepared for a potential negative surprise. And if you look at where we're at from a price perspective, new crop corn, while 20 cents off of its most recent peak, is still in most cases a break-even territory for many producers. I think we need to address that break-even opportunity with some defense. Options are at the top of my list to do that. And so as we look at all of the potential, we have to accept both outcomes, because coupled with tariffs, we have this Chinese ship fee. And next week's reports also includes a grain stocks fee, which on the heels of January's adjustment might be a little wild. So there's all sorts of different things out there that become a risk. And if we're not managing risk while hoping for opportunity, we're kidding ourselves.
Weather's kind of taken a backseat right now, Sean, when you look at these markets. So when you look at Brazil and the second crop corn, they've just experienced some dryness. How dry has it been? And do you think it's going to impact production there?
In the month of March, we have seen the driest March for the entire second crop corn area of Brazil since 1950. That's a fact. And what's driving this dry weather, which in our view, in our work, is going to continue into April when they start pollinating, which means we are not anticipating that we're going to get much of a bounce from last year's terrible corn crop, which really took the Brazilian export market off the table and allowed the U.S., us, to sell a lot more corn. That's going to be a very important driver once we settle the score next week with some of these other factors. Mother Nature will always come back as the prime driver when we get into the heart of the growing season.
Yeah, Mike, when do you think Mother Nature comes back into the conversation with traders and we start trading weather again?
It I think is more of a summer conversation. And even then, I would bring caution to the conversation, because if you look at the last several summers, we've talked about dry weather and the impact on the crop. And, among trade circles, it's a bit of a boy who cried wolf type of experience right now, because after all of those experiences, we've found near record, or in last year's case, record crops on the other side. So it's going to have to be a very convincing weather story to bring people in any earlier. Most are going to hold out to see, is this real?
Sean, what is the one thing in the markets you think that traders aren't focused on enough, or we're not talking about enough, that could impact prices for farmers?
Well, I think what he just said is exactly what the market, I think, is getting it's getting too comfortable with the idea that weather can't hurt the U.S. corn crop anymore, or the U.S. grain crop anymore. The last 4 years, the reason that we've come along with only having modestly below trend line yield crops is because the month of July has been cool and wet, despite drought before and after. We have just experienced, Tyne, a sudden stratospheric warming event. Only 6 other times have we seen this, where the stratosphere above the Arctic region gets super hot. When you correlate that, there's a high propensity for an extremely dry July, which would kind of flip the scales to what we've seen in the last 4 years, where it might not be so dry before, it might not be so dry after, but when it counts during key pollination and pod setting, could actually create a much greater outcome to the downside on yields than the market is now saying is dialing in. And I think that's something to really watch this particular year, because this is a really unusual weather variable that we don't normally see.
Super interesting. Mike, what is the one thing you think that the market isn't focused on enough that's taking a backseat right now that could impact prices?
Well, I think if you couple with what Sean's saying, if we end up with a weather scenario this summer and we pencil in some of these demand adjustments that I alluded to earlier, and it's just as true on the ethanol side as it has been on exports. We've had strong demand that's outperforming projection. If we come back later and then make cuts to the balance sheet by way of demand, and then we make cuts again to the production in the 2025 crop, we have the setup for a very explosive upside, but we need a lot of stars to align to get us there, especially with, this tariff in play. Demand could be curtailed, a ton. And, the flip side of this too, is if we bet against production and then we get it, it cuts us twice as hard the other direction.
Yeah, a lot of things to watch in the future, but one thing's for certain, next week could be a pretty interesting week to watch. Sean, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. We need to take a quick break, and then we're checking in with Machinery Pete for Tractor Tales next.